Welcome, everyone. Today, we delve into a profoundly difficult and contentious issue. Should minors over the age of 12 be prosecuted as adults in court? This question touches upon fundamental aspects of justice, accountability, child development, and public safety. It forces us to consider where the line blurs between childhood and adulthood in the eyes of the law, especially when serious crimes are committed. Joining us today are experts and advocates with diverse perspectives. We have Marcus Bellwether, a seasoned prosecutor, Dr. Alicia Sharma, a child psychologist specializing in adolescent development, Robert Davies, a representative for victims' rights organizations, and Chloe Martinez, a social worker with extensive experience in the juvenile justice system. Thank you all for being here. Marcus, perhaps you could start us off? From a prosecutorial standpoint, why is the option to try certain minors as adults considered necessary?
Thank you, Sarah. The reality is, some crimes committed by individuals over 12 are indistinguishable in their brutality and impact from those committed by adults. We are talking about premeditated murder, aggravated assault, serious sexual offenses. When faced with such severity, the juvenile system, primarily focused on rehabilitation, sometimes falls short in delivering adequate consequences and ensuring public safety. The adult system provides mechanisms for longer sentences, acting as a stronger deterrent and reflecting the gravity of the offense. It's not about retribution for its own sake. It's about acknowledging the harm caused and ensuring accountability proportionate to the act. For certain heinous crimes, the label of minor cannot erase the adult nature of the conduct.
Dr. Sharma, how does the perspective of child psychology align or conflict with this view?
From a developmental perspective, it conflicts significantly, Sarah. The adolescent brain is fundamentally different from the adult brain. Key areas responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and risk assessment, the prefrontal cortex, are still undergoing critical development well into the early 20s. This means a 13 or 14-year-old, even one who commits a terrible act, often lacks the same level of cognitive maturity and moral culpability as an adult. Their decision-making processes are inherently less developed, making them more susceptible to peer pressure, less able to foresee consequences, and, importantly, more amenable to rehabilitation. Prosecuting them as adults ignores this crucial biological and psychological reality. It imposes a framework designed for fully developed minds onto individuals who are still maturing, potentially causing irreparable harm to their future development and increasing the likelihood of recidivism.
Robert, you work closely with victims and their families. What is their perspective on this issue, particularly when the offender is a minor?
Thank you. For victims and their families, the age of the perpetrator often feels secondary to the devastating impact of the crime. A life taken, a future destroyed. The pain is the same regardless of whether the offender is 15 or 35. They see a system that sometimes seems more focused on the offender's potential than on the victim's suffering and the community's safety. While rehabilitation is a laudable goal, it cannot come at the expense of justice for those harmed. When a minor commits an adult crime, particularly one demonstrating planning and extreme violence, many victims feel the adult court system is the only venue capable of providing a sentence that truly reflects the severity and ensures the offender is off the streets for a significant period. It's about acknowledging the reality of the harm done.
Chloe, as a social worker in the juvenile system, what alternatives or nuances do you see? The juvenile system isn't monolithic, and it has evolved. There are mechanisms within it, like extended juvenile jurisdiction, that allow for longer periods of supervision and intervention, sometimes extending into early adulthood, without resorting to a full adult prosecution. Transferring a child to the adult system is often a pathway to adult incarceration, which is a demonstrably harmful environment for adolescents. It exposes them to violence, limits educational and therapeutic opportunities, and drastically increases the chances they will reoffend upon release. We need to invest more in robust juvenile justice programs that combine accountability with intensive, developmentally appropriate interventions. Focusing solely on transfer ignores the systemic factors: poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity, that often contribute to youth offending. Marcus, Dr. Sharma mentioned brain development. How does the legal system account for this? Is there a threshold of understanding that determines whether a minor can be tried as an adult?
The law does recognize diminished capacity, but the standard for transferring a minor often involves assessing factors like the seriousness of the offense, the minor's history, the sophistication of the crime, and whether the juvenile system can realistically rehabilitate them within its time frame. It's not a decision taken lightly. There are usually waiver hearings where evidence regarding the minor's maturity, culpability, and amenability to treatment is presented. While brain science is relevant, the law must also weigh the act itself and its consequences for society and the victims. We cannot let developmental arguments completely overshadow the need for justice in cases of extreme violence. A 16-year-old who plans and executes a school shooting demonstrates a level of understanding and intent that demands a response beyond what the typical juvenile system offers.
But Marcus, the very fact that these hearings exist acknowledges the inherent difference. The issue is whether that difference is adequately weighed against the severity of the crime. Research consistently shows that adolescents processed in the adult system have higher rates of suicide, are more likely to be physically and sexually assaulted, and reoffend at higher rates than comparable youth retained in the juvenile system. Is that enhanced public safety? Furthermore, the trauma of adult incarceration can stunt the very developmental progress we hope for, making rehabilitation far less likely. We might achieve a longer sentence initially, but are we creating a more dangerous individual in the long run?
Dr. Sharma raises a critical point about long-term outcomes. Robert, how do victims' families grapple with the idea that a harsher sentence in the adult system might lead to higher recidivism later?
It's an incredibly difficult calculation. The immediate priority for many victims is safety and the sense that justice has been served for the specific, terrible act they endured. The abstract possibility of future recidivism feels less concrete than the present pain and fear. They hear about rehabilitation, but they also see cases where individuals released from the juvenile system reoffend violently. There's a deep-seated fear that the juvenile system is simply not equipped to handle offenders who have demonstrated extreme violence, regardless of their age. It feels like a gamble they are being asked to take with their own safety and the safety of others. The adult system, with its potential for life sentences in the most extreme cases, offers a sense of finality and security that the juvenile system often cannot promise.
But is that security real or illusory if the system itself contributes to future crime? Chloe, what are the alternatives that could bridge this gap between accountability and rehabilitation? There are promising models. Blended sentencing allows courts to impose both a juvenile and an adult sentence, with the adult sentence suspended contingent on the youth's compliance with the juvenile disposition. This provides a strong incentive for rehabilitation while keeping the option of adult consequences available. Restorative justice practices, where appropriate and with victim consent, can also play a role. Bringing offenders face-to-face with the harm they caused within a structured and supportive process can foster genuine remorse and accountability in ways traditional punishment often doesn't. We also need significant investment in specialized juvenile facilities equipped to handle serious offenders with intensive therapy, education, and vocational training, rather than simply warehousing them or transferring them to adult prisons ill-suited for their needs. Marcus, are these alternatives, like blended sentencing, sufficient for the kinds of severe cases you mentioned earlier?
Blended sentencing can be a useful tool in certain cases, offering a middle ground. However, for the most egregious offenses, calculated murders, gang-related executions, mass casualty events planned and carried out by older teens. It may not suffice. The public expects a certain level of denunciation for such acts, and the juvenile system, even with blended options, might not provide sentences perceived as proportionate. There's also the jurisdictional limit. The juvenile system typically loses authority once the individual reaches a certain age, often 21 or 25. If a 17-year-old commits multiple murders, is release at 25 truly an adequate response that ensures long-term public safety? The adult system allows for sentences, including life without parole in some jurisdictions, that reflect the permanent consequences of such actions.
The concept of life without parole for someone who committed a crime as a minor is itself highly controversial and raises serious Eighth Amendment questions regarding cruel and unusual punishment. Supreme Court rulings have acknowledged the lessened culpability of juveniles and mandated individualized sentencing considerations. Imposing an irrevocable sentence designed for adults on someone whose brain and character were still forming ignores their potential for growth and change, however distant it may seem at the time of the offense. It represents a fundamental pessimism about human development that runs counter to what we know about adolescent psychology. Rehabilitation might be difficult, but condemning a child to die in prison negates that possibility entirely.
But Dr. Sharma, what about the victims who have received a life sentence of loss? Isn't there a need for parallelism in justice? The pain of victims is immense and undeniable. Justice must acknowledge that pain. However, responding to irreversible loss with an irreversible punishment for a minor raises profound ethical questions. Is justice solely about retribution? Or does it also encompass the potential for transformation, especially for young people? Focusing only on the offender's age can feel like minimizing the victim's experience. We need a system that validates their suffering while still acknowledging the unique status of adolescent offenders. Perhaps the focus should be less on adult versus juvenile court and more on creating a system that can impose appropriately serious consequences while maximizing rehabilitative potential, regardless of the venue.
Chloe, you mentioned systemic factors. How does socioeconomic background or race play into decisions about transferring minors to adult court? Disparities are stark and deeply concerning. Studies consistently show that youth of color, particularly Black and Hispanic youth, are disproportionately transferred to the adult system compared to white youth, even when charged with similar offenses and having similar criminal histories. Youth from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are also more likely to be transferred. This suggests that factors beyond the crime itself, implicit bias, access to quality legal representation, availability of community-based resources, heavily influence these life-altering decisions. Transferring a minor to adult court becomes not just a question of justice for a specific crime, but also a reflection of broader societal inequities. It risks punishing children more harshly based on their race or economic status, which is fundamentally unjust. Marcus, how does the prosecution system address these concerns about disparity?
Prosecutors are bound by ethical obligations to apply the law fairly and without prejudice. Transfer decisions are supposed to be based on objective criteria outlined in statutes, focusing on the offense, the offender's history, and amenability to treatment. However, we must acknowledge that implicit bias is a societal problem that can manifest within the justice system. Ongoing training, data collection, and review processes are crucial to identify and mitigate disparities in transfer decisions, but the severity of the crime must remain a primary factor. Disparities need to be addressed through systemic reforms and checks, not by refusing to pursue adult charges when the facts of a particularly heinous crime, regardless of the perpetrator's background, seem to warrant it according to the law.
The issue is that the objective criteria themselves can be subjective in application. Assessing sophistication or amenability to treatment involves judgment calls where bias can creep in. Furthermore, early life trauma and exposure to violence, which are more prevalent in disadvantaged communities, can impact behavior in ways that might be misinterpreted as inherent criminality rather than a response to environment. Treating the symptom, the crime, in adult court without addressing the root causes accessible through juvenile interventions seems counterproductive.
We seem to be circling back to the core tension: accountability for serious harm versus the developmental nature and potential of youth. Robert, if not adult court for the most serious cases, what would satisfy victims' need for justice and safety?
It's less about a specific court and more about the outcome. Victims need to see meaningful consequences that reflect the gravity of the harm. They need assurance that the offender will not be quickly released to potentially harm others. If the juvenile system could guarantee longer periods of secure confinement for the most violent offenses, coupled with truly effective rehabilitation programs and rigorous post-release supervision, perhaps the push for adult transfer would lessen. The current perception, rightly or wrongly, is often that the juvenile system is too lenient for the worst crimes. There needs to be truth in sentencing, even within the juvenile framework. A sentence should mean something tangible, providing a sense of closure and security for those whose lives have been shattered.
That points towards strengthening the juvenile system rather than defaulting to the adult one. Chloe, what would an ideal strengthened juvenile system look like for serious offenders? It would be adequately funded, for starters. It would employ highly trained staff, including mental health professionals, specializing in adolescent trauma and development. Facilities would be secure but therapeutic, not punitive mini-prisons. It would offer tailored educational and vocational programs to provide pathways to a different future. Crucially, it would involve families and communities in the rehabilitation process wherever possible. And yes, for very serious offenses, it would have mechanisms for extended jurisdiction, ensuring supervision and support continue into early adulthood as needed. This approach recognizes the seriousness of the offense and the need for public safety. But crucially, it doesn't give up on the young person. It invests in their potential for change, which, as Dr. Sharma noted, is neurologically greater than that of adults.
While a strengthened juvenile system is a worthy goal, we must be realistic. Are we prepared, as a society, to make the significant financial investment required for such a system? And even with the best programs, some individuals, despite their youth, may demonstrate through their actions a level of dangerousness that requires the long-term incapacitation only available in the adult system. The option needs to remain available for those extreme, albeit rare, cases.
The cost of not investing is arguably higher. The cost of adult incarceration, the cost of higher recidivism rates, the societal cost of lost potential and continued cycles of violence. Labeling a child as an adult criminal has lifelong consequences. Felony records that prevent employment, housing, and education opportunities, effectively creating a permanent underclass. This isn't just about the individual. It impacts entire communities.
We are nearing the end of our time. I'd like to ask each of you for a brief concluding thought on this complex issue. Marcus?
Public safety and accountability for the most serious violent crimes must remain paramount. While the juvenile system should be the default, the option to transfer minors who commit heinous adult-like crimes to the adult system is a necessary tool to achieve justice for victims and protect society.
Dr. Sharma?
Adolescence is a period of profound developmental vulnerability and potential. Prosecuting children as adults ignores fundamental brain science, risks immense long-term harm, and often proves counterproductive to public safety. Our focus should be on building a robust juvenile justice system that holds youth accountable in developmentally appropriate ways.
Robert?
The pain of victims demands a justice system that delivers meaningful consequences and ensures safety. Whether in juvenile or adult court, the outcome must reflect the severity of the crime and provide assurance that violent offenders will not easily harm again. Victims deserve to feel heard and protected.
And Chloe? Transferring youth to the adult system is often a shortcut that ignores underlying issues and exacerbates inequalities. Investing in evidence-based juvenile justice interventions, restorative practices, and addressing systemic factors offers a more just and effective path towards both accountability and long-term community safety. Thank you all for this insightful and challenging discussion. It's clear there are no easy answers, balancing the gravity of certain crimes with the unique nature of adolescence. You've given us much to consider regarding